Somewhere in a climate-controlled case in the British Museum sits a small, unassuming object that most visitors walk straight past on their way to louder, shinier things. It is a four-sided block of baked clay, barely the size of a rolling pin, covered edge to edge in tiny, repetitive wedge-shaped marks. There is no gold on it, no dramatic imagery, nothing that would stop a casual visitor mid-stride the way a gilded sarcophagus or a jeweled headdress might. And yet, that little clay prism is, in its own quiet way, one of the strangest documents human beings have ever produced. It claims that in the earliest days of civilization, kings sat on their thrones for tens of thousands of years. It claims that after a catastrophic flood swept the land clean, kingship itself had to descend from the heavens a second time, landing in a new city as though the old order had simply been switched off and rebooted. For almost 2 centuries now, this object has sat at the center of one of the most persistent, most genuinely unresolved arguments in the entire field of ancient history. That object is the Weld-Blundell prism, and it is only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Because here is the strange part of the story, the part most people never stop to think about. 200 years ago, nobody on Earth knew Sumer had existed. Not scholars, not priests, not the most well-read historians working in the great libraries of Europe. An entire civilization, the people who invented the wheel, the city, the written law code, and writing itself, had been erased so completely from human memory that its own name had to be rediscovered before anyone could even begin looking for its ruins. This wasn't a case of a well-known culture simply waiting to be studied more closely, the way Egypt or Greece always were. This was closer to detective work performed on a civilization that had vanished so thoroughly it left behind not even a rumor. Tonight, we are counting down the 25 discoveries that dragged that civilization back out of the ground, one careful piece at a time. We are going from the base of a windswept cliff in western Iran to the gold-filled tombs of southern Iraq. We are going from a burned Assyrian library buried under the rubble of a palace destroyed in 612 BC all the way up to a laboratory today running machine learning models against 500,000 broken clay fragments scattered across museum basements on 4 different continents. Along the way, we are going to keep circling back to that strange little prism and the question it has never quite stopped asking. What do you do with an ancient document that appears to tell the truth about almost everything except, apparently, time itself? It helps, before we start counting down, to have a rough sense of the map. Sumer was never a single unified kingdom in the way most people picture ancient Egypt under one pharaoh. It was, for most of its history, a shifting collection of independent, often rival city-states. Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Nippur, Kish, Lagash, and several others, each with its own patron god, its own dynasty of rulers, and its own ambitions, loosely bound together by a shared language, a shared religious worldview, and a shared writing system, but frequently at war with one another over land, water rights, and prestige. That patchwork political reality is going to matter later tonight, when we get into exactly how and why a document like the Sumerian King List chose to describe that messy, competitive history as one tidy, unbroken line of single rulers passing kingship city to city. For now, just picture the region the way it actually was on the ground. A crowded, ambitious, occasionally violent cluster of walled cities strung out along the lower reaches of 2 great rivers, each one convinced, in its own official records, that it held the rightful, divinely sanctioned center of the civilized world. So get comfortable. This is going to take a while. Let's get into it. Before any of these 25 discoveries could happen, historians first had to solve a far stranger and far more basic problem than any single excavation could address. They had to figure out that there was anything to discover at all. Sumer is not like Egypt, whose pyramids stood in plain view of every traveler who ever crossed the Nile Valley, or Greece, whose myths and philosophers were copied and recopied by European monks for 1,000 years without a break. Sumer had vanished so thoroughly that by the early 19th century, educated Europeans simply did not use the word. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates was known, if it was known at all, through the Bible, through a handful of scattered references buried in Greek and Roman writers who themselves were describing a world already centuries gone, and through enormous, mysterious mounds rising unexplained out of the flat Iraqi desert. Local people called these mounds tells, and they had been quietly weathering in the sun for thousands of years, holding their secrets, waiting for someone with the right tools and the right questions to come looking. Underneath those mounds was a language unrelated to anything else ever found on the planet, a true isolate, with no known living or dead relatives anywhere in the historical or linguistic record. Cracking it open would take the better part of a century. Several competing and occasionally quite bitter rival scholars working across 3 different countries, a dangerous cliff face in western Iran, and no small amount of sheer luck. There's a useful way to picture just how strange this situation actually was, from the perspective of a 19th century scholar looking at the problem fresh. Imagine finding thousands of pages of a completely unknown script, in a completely unknown language, with no bilingual text to work from, no living speaker to consult, and no closely related language anywhere on Earth to use as a comparative anchor. That is roughly the position early Assyriologists found themselves in once they pushed past the Akkadian layer and hit the older Sumerian material underneath it. Akkadian, at least, was a Semitic language, and scholars already had centuries of accumulated expertise in Hebrew and Arabic to draw on for comparison. Sumerian offered no such shortcut. Every grammatical rule, every verb form, every basic building block of the language had to be worked out essentially from scratch, purely from internal patterns within the texts themselves, a process closer to breaking a code with no key at all than to translating a foreign language in any conventional sense. That is where our countdown begins. Act 1. Rediscovering a lost civilization. Number 25. The Behistun inscription and the decipherment of Cuneiform High on a limestone cliff in what is now western Iran, roughly 100 meters above the old caravan road that once linked Babylon to the cities of the Persian plateau. The ancient king Darius the Great ordered an enormous inscription carved into the rock face sometime around 500 BC. It was, by design, meant to be read by almost nobody. Darius had it placed so high and on such a precariously sheer surface that ordinary travelers on the road below could barely make out that writing was even there, let alone climb up to read it. The inscription recorded, in 3 separate cuneiform scripts running in parallel columns, Darius's own account of his rise to power and his brutal suppression of a wave of rebellions that had threatened to tear apart the young Persian Empire. For over 2,000 years it sat there in the open air, slowly weathering, its meaning understood by absolutely no one alive. In the 1830s, and continuing well into the 1840s, a young British East India Company officer named Henry Rawlinson became obsessed with it. Rawlinson was stationed in Persia at the time, working what was ostensibly a military and diplomatic post, but he spent every spare hour he could steal making repeated, genuinely dangerous trips up the cliff face. He balanced on makeshift ladders lashed together from whatever timber he could find locally, hung from rope harnesses rigged by local workers he hired for the purpose, and copied down thousands of individual wedge-shaped symbols by hand, often suspended directly over a drop that would have killed him instantly had a single rope given way. This was not the work of a comfortable academic in a well-lit study. It was fieldwork in the most literal, most physically punishing sense of the word, carried out years before anyone could say with certainty that the effort would ever pay off. What made Behistun so uniquely valuable was not simply its length or its age, but its structure. Darius had ordered the same text carved 3 separate times, in 3 different languages, side by side on the same cliff face: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian cuneiform. Rawlinson realized, correctly, that if he could crack the Old Persian portion first, which used a comparatively simple, largely alphabetic style of cuneiform with a manageable number of distinct signs, he would effectively hold a key that could be turned against the far more complex, far more visually crowded Babylonian script sitting right next to it on the same rock. It was, in essence, exactly the same insight that had driven the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs a generation earlier, using the Rosetta Stone, applied now to an entirely different family of scripts on the opposite side of the ancient world. It worked, though it worked slowly, and it did not work in isolation. Rawlinson's efforts ran in parallel, sometimes cooperatively, sometimes in open, prickly competition, with those of other scholars attacking the same problem from different directions. Most notably among them was the Irish clergyman Edward Hincks, whose insights into the underlying grammar and internal logic of the cuneiform system were arguably every bit as important as Rawlinson's dramatic cliffside transcription work, even though Hincks himself never set foot anywhere near Mesopotamia. Later, the French Orientalist Julius Oppert, who we will meet again in just a moment under very different circumstances, added crucial refinements of his own. It was, all told, a genuine international race, part rivalry and part slow, grudging, ultimately productive collaboration, playing out in scholarly journals and private correspondence across the 1840s, the 1850s, and well into the 1860s, as each man published, argued, quietly borrowed from, and occasionally outright attacked the other's conclusions. By the early 1850s, Cuneiform Babylonian, essentially Akkadian, a Semitic language distantly related to Hebrew and Arabic, could finally be read with genuine, reliable confidence, confirmed in a famous test where several of these rival scholars, working independently and sealed off from one another, were given the same freshly discovered text to translate and produced results that matched closely enough to silence most remaining skeptics, to nothing else that had ever been decoded anywhere on Earth. Even more strangely, Akkadian scribes themselves seemed to treat this older, buried language with something bordering on reverence, using it in religious hymns and formal literary contexts in much the same way medieval European scholars once reached for Latin long after nobody spoke it as a native tongue anymore. Something had clearly come before Babylon, something the Babylonians themselves already considered ancient by their own standards. And at this point in the story, nobody yet had a name for it. It is worth noting that Rawlinson himself never fully lived to see how far this discovery would eventually travel. He went on to a long career in British diplomacy and Assyriology, but the specific puzzle of that older, buried language sitting beneath Akkadian remained, for years, an open question passed between a fairly small circle of specialists corresponding by letter across London, Paris, and Dublin. What is striking, looking back at it now, is how little fanfare surrounded the actual solving of the problem, compared to how enormous its consequences turned out to be. There was no single dramatic unveiling, no headline moment the way Carter's tomb opening would later generate. It was closer to a slow tide coming in, one careful scholarly paper at a time, until one day the shoreline of ancient history had simply moved. That naming moment is precisely where our next discovery picks up the thread. Number 24. Jules Oppert. Names Sumerian discovery. 24 did not happen in a desert, and it did not involve a single shovel breaking ground for the first time anywhere. It happened at a desk, buried in stacks of freshly transcribed cuneiform texts, and it is one of the strangest entries on this entire list, precisely because it is a discovery made entirely through close, patient reading, rather than through excavation. By the late 1860s, decipherment specialists, working steadily through the growing pile of Mesopotamian cuneiform texts, kept encountering royal titles that repeated across multiple documents from multiple different rulers. King of Sumer and Akkad. Akkad, by this point, was reasonably well understood. It referred to the Semitic-speaking civilization centered on the Akkadian language, and later, more famously, on the city of Babylon itself. Sumer, however, remained a genuine mystery, a name attached to nothing anyone could yet point to on a map or connect to any known ruins. In 1869, the French Assyriologist Julius Oppert, the same Oppert who had helped crack Behistun's Babylonian column years earlier, made a proposal that would end up formally naming an entire lost civilization for the modern world, that this older, structurally unrelated language, buried beneath layer after layer of Akkadian cuneiform, should be called, from that point forward, Sumerian, taking the name directly from the ancient royal titles that referenced it. It sounds, described this way, like a small administrative decision, the kind of thing that might merit a single footnote in a specialist journal, and nothing more. In practice, it changed everything about how scholars approached the flood of material continuing to come out of Mesopotamian excavations. Once there was a name, there was suddenly a category to organize evidence around. Once there was a category, there was, for the first time, something concrete to go looking for in the ground. A defined target, rather than a vague, unfocused sense that something older than Babylon must be sitting down there somewhere, unclassified and unexplained. It is worth pausing here to compare this directly to Egypt or Greece, civilizations whose names, gods, and basic historical outlines were never seriously in doubt at any point in European intellectual history. Sumer had to be built back into the historical record from language first, and only afterward from dirt. Oppert's naming moment is the precise hinge between those two phases of the story, the last purely philological discovery on this list, and the last one that happens before shovels start hitting the ground in earnest, in the sections still to come. It's also worth pointing out how quickly the term caught on once it existed. Within a decade of Oppert's proposal, Sumerian had become the standard working term across French, German, and British scholarship alike, despite the usual academic tendency for national schools of thought to argue over terminology for a generation before settling anything. Part of the reason it spread so fast is that it filled an obvious gap nobody had quite been able to name before. Scholars had been dancing around the concept for years, referring awkwardly to the pre-Semitic language or the Akkadian substratum, clumsy phrases that described a shadow without describing the thing casting it. Oppert gave that shadow a proper name, and once that happened, an entire generation of excavators suddenly had a much clearer sense of exactly what they were digging for every time they broke ground at a new mound in southern Iraq. Number 23. Tel el-Mukayyar is identified as Ur. While Rawlinson was still hanging off the Behistun cliff face in the 1840s, a separate group of British researchers were already working the ground directly in southern Iraq, largely under the sponsorship of the British Museum, which had grown increasingly eager to compete with French institutions for prestige objects coming out of the ancient Near East. In the 1850s, a British political agent and enthusiastic amateur archaeologist named J.E. Taylor led a campaign of excavations at a massive, heavily eroded mound known locally as Tel el-Mukayyar, sitting in the flat, featureless river plain of southern Mesopotamia, not far from the modern city of Nasiriyah. What Taylor's team confirmed at that mound would turn out to be one of the single most important city identifications in the entire history of the field. This was, beyond reasonable doubt, ancient Ur, home to the Great Ziggurat of the moon god Nana, a city referenced both in Cuneiform historical records and, far more famously to 19th century readers, in the biblical account of Abraham's own origins before he set out for Canaan. At the time, confirming this identification was largely a matter of painstaking comparative work rather than dramatic revelation, matching inscribed clay cylinders recovered from foundation deposits at the site, left there deliberately by ancient kings as a kind of permanent construction record, against known royal names already documented from other sources. It was quiet, careful, unglamorous scholarship, the sort of thing that rarely made headlines even in its own time. But in the 1850s, this was not yet the spectacular kind of discovery that a tomb full of gold represents. It was foundational, in the truest sense of that word, literally and figuratively. Taylor's team planted a flag on the map of world history that would matter enormously 70 years later, when a very different British archaeologist named Leonard Woolley returned to that exact same mound and found something that would make headlines around the entire world, rivaling even the most famous Egyptian discovery of the 20th century. We will get to that story in full detail later tonight. For now, simply remember the name of the mound, Tel el-Mukayyar, Ur. It is going to come up again, and when it does, it is going to come up in a very big way. It's worth noting that Taylor's own excavation methods, by later standards, were fairly rough. 19th century fieldwork generally prioritized recovering inscribed objects quickly over carefully documenting exactly where and how each layer of soil related to the next, and a considerable amount of contextual information from these early digs at Ur was almost certainly lost, simply because nobody yet understood how valuable that context would eventually become to future researchers. This is a pattern that repeats itself across several of the earliest discoveries on this list. The 19th century gave archaeology its first great confirmations, but it would take the more disciplined, more painstaking techniques developed in the following century, techniques Leonard Woolley himself would help pioneer at this very site, before Sumerian archaeology matured from simple treasure recovery into something closer to genuine forensic reconstruction of an entire vanished society. It is also worth being careful here about exactly what identifying Ur as Abraham's homeland does and does not establish. The biblical connection generated enormous public interest in the site throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and it is genuinely part of why Ur received so much sustained excavation attention compared to some other equally important Sumerian cities. But confirming that this mound was the historical city of Ur, referenced in later Mesopotamian and biblical sources, is a considerably more modest claim than confirming any specific detail of the Abraham narrative itself, which remains, as it has for well over a century of biblical scholarship, a separate and much more contested question that this particular archaeological identification neither proves nor disproves on its own. Number 22. Eridu and the search for the first city. If Ur was where the story of Sumerian archaeology would eventually gain its single most famous chapter, Eridu is where Sumerian mythology itself insists the entire story actually begins. According to the opening line of the Sumerian king list, the same extraordinary document that anchors our closing segment tonight, and the same one sitting in that quiet museum case we opened this video with, kingship itself first descended from heaven in the city of Eridu, before later being carried off, city by city, dynasty by dynasty, across the floodplain of southern Mesopotamia, over the course of what the text presents as an almost unimaginably long span of deep time. Excavations at the mound, known as Tel Abu Shahrain, identified with reasonable confidence as ancient Eridu, were carried out in phases across much of the 20th century, with particularly significant Iraqi-led work conducted in the decades following the Second World War by the archaeologist Fuad Safar, working under the auspices of Iraq's own Directorate of Antiquities, at a time when the country was increasingly determined to lead its own excavation programs rather than leaving the work entirely to foreign missions. What Safar's team found beneath the surface at Eridu was remarkable in a very specific, very concrete way. They uncovered a sequence of temples, built one directly on top of another, layer after successive layer, stretching back into what archaeologists call the Ubaid period, roughly the 5th millennium BC, well over 1,000 years before the rise of the great Sumerian cities that would later define the region. Each time an old shrine at Eridu fell into disrepair, generation after generation, the people living there did not clear the ground and build somewhere entirely new, the way a modern developer might simply bulldoze an old structure and start fresh on an adjacent lot. Instead, they rebuilt directly on top of the previous temple's own foundations, again and again, layer after layer, for well over 1,000 years of continuous, unbroken religious use, at the exact same spot, on the exact same low rise of ground, above the surrounding marshland. This is one of the rare places on this entire list where ancient legend and hard physical stratigraphy actually line up with each other in a genuinely striking way. The myths call Eridu first. The dirt, dug up independently, centuries later, by archaeologists with no interest whatsoever in confirming ancient religious claims, quietly agrees that Eridu is among the oldest continuously occupied religious sites anywhere in the entire region. That agreement does not, on its own, prove every single claim the Sumerians eventually made about their own deep origins. We are going to spend a great deal of time later tonight examining the real limits of that kind of reasoning, but it is a genuinely remarkable case of oral tradition and physical excavation lining up almost perfectly, and it set a serious, cautious tone for how later archaeologists would go on to treat Sumerian self-description more broadly. There is a broader point worth drawing out here, one that will resurface repeatedly across tonight's countdown. Eridu sat, in ancient times, at the very edge of the southern marshlands, close to where the Tigris and Euphrates historically emptied toward the Persian Gulf, a landscape that has itself shifted dramatically over the intervening millennia as the coastline slowly retreated and the rivers changed course. Some researchers have suggested that Eridu's deep symbolic importance to the Sumerians, its status as the place kingship first descended to earth, may be connected to its position at this ecological threshold, the meeting point between fresh water, salt water, and dry land, a boundary zone that shows up again and again in Sumerian religious imagery as a kind of primordial creation point. Whether or not that specific reading is correct, it's a useful early example of how much Sumerian mythology was shaped by the very particular, very unusual geography its people actually lived in. It's also worth noting how differently Eridu's ancient importance compares to its modern visibility. Unlike Ur, with its dramatic ziggurat still partially standing and its woolly excavated treasures filling museum galleries, Eridu today is a comparatively modest, low-lying mound, difficult for a casual visitor to appreciate without already knowing what once stood there. The site has not benefited from anywhere near the same level of sustained international excavation attention as Ur or Uruk, and large sections of it, including whatever remains of its earliest Ubaid period layers beneath later construction, are still only partially explored. It stands as a useful reminder, right at the very start of this list, that a site's historical importance and a site's modern visibility don't always line up neatly. Some of the most consequential places in this entire story remain, even now, considerably less thoroughly excavated than their significance would seem to demand. Number 21. Ernest de Sarzec and the discovery of Lagash. Our first act closes with a discovery that happened almost entirely by accident, made by a man who was not, strictly speaking, supposed to be conducting archaeology at all. In 1877, a French vice-consul stationed in southern Iraq named Ernest de Sarzec began digging at a mound called Tello, largely out of personal curiosity, a diplomat's convenient access to the region, and what appears to have been a fairly casual initial interest that quickly turned into something far more serious once the first finds started coming out of the ground. What he found there turned out to be the ancient city of Gursu, the religious and administrative heart of a larger city-state known as Lagash, one of the most powerful and, for a long time, most poorly understood political centers of the early Sumerian world. Dsarzek's excavations at Tello produced the first genuinely large, unmistakably Sumerian body of art and inscriptions ever recovered anywhere on Earth. Carved statues, foundation tablets, monumental inscribed objects, arriving years before Sumerian was even widely accepted by the broader academic world, let alone the general reading public, as a real and historically distinct ancient civilization in its own right. It is genuinely difficult to overstate how significant this moment was at the time it happened. Egypt, by the 1870s, already had its pyramids on permanent, celebrated display in the public imagination. Assyria and Babylon already had their famous winged bull statues installed in the galleries of the Louvre and the British Museum, drawing enormous crowds. Sumer, before Tello, had almost nothing physical to point to at all. A name, a decoded language, a handful of scattered references, and very little else a museum visitor could actually stand in front of and look at. Dsarzek's digs changed that reality in a single, decisive stroke, and they quietly set up two of the most important discoveries still to come later on this list. A war memorial carved directly into stone, commemorating a real and datable military campaign, and a series of calm, contemplative statues belonging to a later ruler of Lagash, whose face remains, even today, one of the most immediately recognizable images to survive from the entire ancient Near East. By the early 1880s, three entirely separate threads of evidence had finally converged into something coherent, a decoded script, thanks to the combined efforts of Rawlinson, Hincks, and Oppert, a named lost language, thanks specifically to Oppert's 1869 proposal, and now, finally, shovels in exactly the right ground, both at Ur and now at Tello. Sumer was no longer a theory confined to a handful of specialist scholarly journals read by a tiny circle of experts. It was, by the 1880s, a genuine civilization with a rapidly growing pile of physical evidence behind it, and the digging, as it turned out, had barely even started. Dsarzek himself would go on to spend the better part of 2 decades returning to Tello across multiple excavation campaigns, and the French Louvre, which acquired the bulk of his finds, effectively became the world's first great public repository of Sumerian art, years before comparable British and American collections caught up. There is a small irony worth noting here. Dsarzek, a diplomat with no formal archaeological training, working with a comparatively modest budget and a small local labor force, ended up making a find that would shape the entire direction of a young academic discipline. It is a pattern that shows up more than once across this list. Some of the most consequential discoveries in Sumerian archaeology were made not by large, well-funded institutional expeditions, but by individuals who happened to be in the right place, with enough curiosity and persistence to keep digging after the first few promising fragments turned up. Act 2. The Birth of the City and the Word. With Sumer's existence now firmly confirmed beyond any reasonable scholarly doubt, the next wave of major discoveries pushed the story back even further than most researchers had initially expected, not simply into the question of who ruled Sumer and when, but into the far more fundamental question of how cities, organized writing, and formal record-keeping came to exist at all, anywhere, for the very first time in human history. This second act covers 5 discoveries that, taken together as a group, describe something genuinely remarkable: the precise moment human beings first figured out how to live together in truly large numbers in one fixed place, and the closely related moment they first figured out a reliable way to write any of it down for later reference. It's worth setting up why these two developments, dense urban living and written record-keeping, turned out to be so tightly linked in the first place, rather than arriving separately or by coincidence. Small farming villages, of the kind that dominated the world before Uruk's rise, could generally run on memory and face-to-face trust. Everyone knew everyone else. Disputes could be settled by a respected elder who had personally witnessed most of the relevant history, and there simply wasn't enough surplus grain, enough traded goods, or enough strangers moving through to require anything more formal. Once a settlement crossed some threshold, a few thousand people, then tens of thousands, that informal system broke down almost immediately. You cannot run a functioning economy for 40,000 people on memory alone. Writing, in that light, wasn't simply a clever invention that happened to occur around the same time cities were growing. It was very likely a direct, practical response to a specific administrative crisis. Too many people, too many transactions, and not enough shared memory to hold it all together without some kind of external record. Number 20. Uruk, the White Temple and the Eanna Precinct. Beginning in 1912 and continuing in repeated campaigns across most of the 20th century, right up through periods of serious political disruption in the region, the German Oriental Society undertook one of the longest-running, most sustained excavation projects in the entire history of Near Eastern archaeology at the site of Uruk. What their teams slowly, patiently uncovered across those decades was staggering in scale, far beyond what most early 20th century archaeologists had expected to find anywhere in the region. At the physical and symbolic heart of the site stood the White Temple, perched dramatically on top of a towering artificial platform, built up layer by layer over generations, an early, unmistakable ancestor of the far more famous ziggurat form that would go on to define Mesopotamian religious architecture for the following 2,000 years. Surrounding it, the Eanna Precinct held a dense cluster of monumental temple buildings dedicated to Inanna, goddess of love and war, constructed, demolished, and rebuilt across many successive centuries of continuous religious activity. The scale of Uruk itself is what makes this discovery so genuinely foundational to almost everything else on this entire countdown. The city's defensive walls stretched for roughly 6 miles around its perimeter, reinforced at their height by hundreds of individual defensive towers spaced along their length. Population estimates for Uruk at its peak, based on careful surveys of the built-up area within those walls, run as high as 40 to 80,000 people, an almost unimaginable concentration of human beings in one single place for the 4th millennium BC, at a time when most of the rest of the inhabited world was still organized into small, scattered farming villages of a few hundred people at most. It is worth being fair here, in the same spirit of intellectual honesty we've tried to maintain throughout this list. There are other serious candidates for the title of the world's first true city, and Jericho and Çatalhöyük both have genuinely strong, well-documented cases of their own. The first city title remains a live, contested question among archaeologists, rather than something fully settled one way or the other. But Uruk's specific combination of raw scale, deliberate urban planning, and monumental religious architecture makes it far and away the strongest candidate specifically for the first city, in the sense most people actually mean when they use that phrase casually. A dense, walled, administratively complex urban center supporting a specialized, non-agricultural economy and a visibly stratified society. This is also, not at all coincidentally, the site that lends its own name to an entire archaeological period, the Uruk period, precisely because of how transformative what happened here turned out to be for everything that came after it. What makes the German excavation project at Uruk especially remarkable is simply how long it has continued, decade after decade, surviving 2 world wars, changes of political regime in both Germany and Iraq, and long stretches where international access to the site was effectively impossible. Very few archaeological projects anywhere in the world have maintained institutional continuity across more than a century of work at a single site, and the layered picture of Uruk's development that has resulted, showing the city's slow, centuries-long growth from a modest settlement into the largest urban center on the planet at the time, simply would not exist without that unusually long-term commitment. It stands as a useful reminder that some of the biggest archaeological insights don't come from a single dramatic season of digging, but from generations of researchers quietly returning to the same ground, again and again, refining the picture a little further each time. Number 19. The Uruk vase recovered from that same Eanna precinct during the German excavations, a single carved alabaster vessel, standing over a meter tall, represents one of the single most important artistic discoveries anywhere in the entire ancient world. The Uruk vase, sometimes referred to instead as the Waka vase, after the modern Arabic name still used locally for the site. Its curved surface is carved in horizontal registers, stacked one above another, each one contributing part of a single continuous visual story, moving upward from raw, unshaped nature at the base of the vessel toward organized human ritual near the top. Plants and river reeds first, then domesticated animals, then a procession of human figures, and finally, at the very summit, a formal scene depicting offerings being ceremonially brought before the goddess Inanna herself. What makes this object matter so much to archaeologists, beyond its obvious age and undeniable beauty, is not simply that it is old, but specifically how it is structured. It is widely considered by specialists in the field to be the earliest known example anywhere in human art of extended narrative relief carving. a sequence of images deliberately arranged to be read almost like a written sentence, one register after another, building a coherent idea from raw material at the bottom of the vessel to organized religious meaning at the top. It is, in a very real and very literal sense, one of the very first stories ever told in stone by any human civilization. Its modern history adds a genuinely sobering coda to an otherwise triumphant discovery story. During the chaos and widespread looting that surrounded the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the Uruk vase was stolen from the Iraq National Museum in Baghdad, along with many thousands of other irreplaceable objects, during the collapse of security at the museum. It was later recovered, though broken into a number of pieces in the process, and has since been carefully restored by conservators. A genuinely useful reminder, sitting right in the middle of this countdown, that the physical record of Sumerian civilization, having somehow managed to survive more than 5,000 years buried safely underground, remains startlingly fragile once it is finally exposed to the world above it. The vase's recovery is itself an interesting footnote in the broader story of Iraq's cultural heritage protection efforts following 2003. It was returned to the museum some weeks after the initial looting, reportedly brought back in pieces inside the trunk of a car, as part of a broader amnesty effort aimed at recovering as many of the thousands of missing objects as possible, without asking too many questions about how they had been removed in the first place. Conservators spent a considerable amount of time afterward carefully piecing the shattered vase back together, and while the restoration is generally considered successful, close inspection still reveals the fracture lines where the ancient alabaster was broken in transit. It is a small, visible scar running across one of the oldest surviving pieces of narrative art in the world, a reminder that this list is not simply a record of triumphant recovery, but occasionally a record of near loss as well. Number 18. Proto-Cuneiform and the invention of writing. If there is a single discovery anywhere on this entire list that most directly and most permanently changed the trajectory of human history as a whole, it might well be this one, and it is also, appropriately enough, one of the least glamorous, least visually striking entries in the whole countdown. Tens of thousands of small clay tablets, recovered from Uruk period excavation layers, dating to roughly 3400 to 3000 BC, contain, when you actually sit down and translate them, essentially none of the things a casual observer might expect. No poetry, no prayers, no royal proclamations celebrating some king's glorious victory in battle. Instead, overwhelmingly, they contain inventories, grain counts, careful records of beer rations distributed to workers, detailed labor rosters, precise records of exactly who owed exactly what to exactly whom, and by when. Writing, it turns out, once you actually look closely at the earliest surviving examples of it anywhere on the planet, was not invented in order to tell stories or to preserve the memorable words of powerful kings for posterity. It was invented, first and foremost, to keep careful track of property. Among these earliest proto-cuneiform administrative tablets, researchers have identified what is very often cited as the oldest personal name preserved anywhere at all in the entire written record of our species. A scribe, or minor official, named Kushim, whose name appears repeatedly across a small cluster of tablets, specifically tracking allocations of barley. Kushim was, in all likelihood, simply an accountant going about a fairly ordinary day's work. He had no possible way of knowing that his name would end up surviving more than 5,000 years into the future, attached to nothing more dramatic or memorable than a grain ledger recording who received how much barley in a given month. There is something almost deflating about this particular discovery, and that is precisely why it earns its place so high on this countdown. So much of the popular imagination surrounding the invention of writing tends to assume something mystical, something ceremonial, something touched by the divine, a sacred gift handed down from the gods, or at the very least, a solemn, world-changing decision made by wise priest-kings. The archaeology, once you actually dig into it, says something quite different. Writing was invented by working bureaucrats for the practical use of other working bureaucrats to solve an extremely mundane, extremely pressing administrative problem. How, exactly, do you run a rapidly growing city of 40,000 people without completely losing track of who has paid their grain tax this season? Everything that came after this modest bureaucratic beginning, the great epics, the formal law codes, the devotional hymns, even the sprawling king lists we are going to spend so much of tonight's closing segment discussing in depth, was ultimately built on top of a record-keeping system invented, first and foremost, to keep an accurate count of beer. It took several more centuries after these earliest proto-cuneiform tablets for the script to develop the flexibility needed to record actual spoken language, rather than simple pictographic counts and tallies. Early proto-cuneiform signs functioned more like a specialized accounting notation than a true writing system capable of capturing grammar, word order, or spoken sentences. The slow transition from that limited administrative notation into a full writing system able to record poetry, law, and personal correspondence is, in its own right, one of the more remarkable intellectual developments documented anywhere in the ancient world. And it happened gradually, tablet by tablet, generation of scribes by generation of scribes, rather than in any single dramatic leap. By the time Enheduanna was composing her hymns roughly 1,000 years later, a discovery we'll reach in Act 5 tonight. That transformation from ledger to literature was essentially complete. Number 17. Cylinder seals. Small, carefully carved cylinders of stone, often no larger around than an adult's finger, rolled steadily across a strip of wet clay to leave behind a continuous, repeating impressed pattern. Cylinder seals represent one of the most consistently underrated categories of discovery in all of Sumerian archaeology, and thousands upon thousands of them have been recovered over the decades from Uruk, from Ur, from Nippur. Functionally, a cylinder seal worked something like a cross between a personal signature and a wax seal on an envelope, used to formally mark ownership of property, to authorize official documents by rolling the seal across the wet clay tablet, and to physically close storage jars against unauthorized tampering by rolling the seal across a lump of clay applied over the stopper. But their real, lasting value to modern historians lies less in their original administrative function and more in what they collectively reveal when studied together as a body of evidence. Because individual seals belong to specific, named individuals, officials, merchants, priests, and eventually even fairly ordinary private citizens, they allow modern researchers to trace specific people and specific artisan workshops across years, and in some documented cases, even multiple decades, of continuous activity, in a way that formal royal inscriptions alone could never accomplish on their own. They also form, considered collectively as a corpus, one of the single richest art historical records to survive from any Bronze Age civilization anywhere in the world, densely packed with vivid mythological scenes, elaborate banquet imagery, and detailed depictions of gods and rulers that meaningfully supplement the far more formal, far more consciously propagandistic official royal record with something closer to genuine everyday visual culture. There is also a slightly unexpected modern angle to these small carved objects. Because cylinder seals were designed to be rolled out repeatedly, producing a clear and legible impression every time, they are unusually forgiving subjects for close photographic and digital study compared to, say, a badly worn stone relief. Museums holding large seal collections have increasingly digitized their impressions in recent years, and the resulting searchable image databases have let researchers cross-reference motifs and workshop styles across collections held on entirely different continents, something that would have taken a single scholar an entire career to do by hand a generation ago. It is a small, quiet example of the same broader trend we'll return to at the very end of tonight's list, when we get to discovery number 1. Old objects, once digitized and cross-referenced at scale, sometimes reveal patterns that were simply invisible when each seal could only be studied in isolation, one museum drawer at a time. Number 16. Nippur and the discovery of Sumerian literature. Our second act closes at Nippur, the recognized religious heart of the entire Sumerian world, home to the great and enormously influential temple of the god Enlil, chief deity of the Sumerian pantheon. Between 1888 and 1900, a University of Pennsylvania expedition working at the site recovered something in the general neighborhood of 30,000 individual cuneiform tablets, an almost unimaginable haul by the standards of the day that would, more than any other single excavation conducted anywhere in the region, go on to become the primary source base for Sumerian literature, mythology, and religious texts, exactly as modern scholars understand them today. Further major excavations at the site, led this time by a University of Chicago team beginning in 1948, continued to substantially add to that already enormous textual record across the following several decades. Nippur held branches of what the Sumerians themselves called the Eduba, or tablet house, functionally ancient scribal schools, where young trainees, some of them apparently quite young indeed based on surviving school exercise tablets, copied out religious hymns, extended mythological narratives, and standardized administrative model documents as a core part of their formal training. That fact alone explains a large part of why so much surviving Sumerian literature happens to be concentrated at this one particular site. It was, quite literally and quite deliberately, a center of ancient textbook production, generation after generation. It is also, not entirely by coincidence, the same site where a much later, far more specific discovery, one tied directly to a single, individually verifiable historical king, would eventually surface from beneath the ruins of Enlil's own temple. We will return to that particular name in detail in Act 4. For now, Nippur brings our second act to a close, as the place where Sumer decisively stopped being only cities, defensive walls, and administrative ledgers, and became, for the very first time in the surviving archaeological record, a civilization with a genuine, deliberately preserved literature of its own. It's worth noting that the sheer volume of material recovered from Nippur created its own long-term challenge, one that echoes forward all the way to discovery number 1 tonight. 30,000 tablets, most of them fragmentary, many duplicating parts of the same underlying compositions in slightly different scribal hands, took generations of specialists working steadily through the 20th century simply to catalog, let alone fully translate and publish. Entire academic careers have been built around editing single literary compositions pieced together from a dozen or more separate, partially overlapping Nippur fragments, scattered today across collections in Philadelphia, Istanbul, and Baghdad. The University of Pennsylvania's own excavation records from the 1888 to 1900 seasons are, by modern standards, notably incomplete, which has occasionally complicated efforts to determine exactly where within the site certain tablets were originally found. A reminder that even a discovery as foundational as this one came with real limitations attached. Act 3. Gold, Death, and the Royal Tombs of Ur. No single excavation anywhere in the region did more to make Sumerian archaeology a genuine household topic discussed in newspapers around the world than what happened at Ur beginning in 1922. This entire act belongs to that one extraordinary dig led by the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley across more than a full decade of sustained, physically grueling excavation work, and it fully deserves every minute of space we're giving it tonight, because almost nothing else anywhere on this list rivals it for sheer visual and emotional impact. It's worth remembering just how differently the wider public had been trained to think about Mesopotamia right up until this excavation began. For most of the 19th century, popular interest in the ancient Near East had focused overwhelmingly on Assyria and Babylon, thanks largely to their biblical associations and to the dramatic winged bull sculptures already on display in London and Paris. Sumer, even after its existence was formally confirmed, remained a comparatively obscure, specialist interest, known mostly through administrative tablets and stone inscriptions rather than anything a general newspaper reader could point to and immediately find beautiful or emotionally affecting. Woolley's tombs changed that almost overnight. For the first time, ordinary people looking at newspaper photographs could see, in gold and lapis lazuli, exactly what Sumerian wealth, Sumerian craftsmanship, and Sumerian ritual actually looked like up close. And the emotional impact of that shift is difficult to overstate. Number 15. Woolley begins at Ur. It is worth pausing here for a moment on the timing, because it is genuinely not a coincidence, and contemporary observers noticed it immediately. 1922 is the exact same year Howard Carter broke into the tomb of Tutankhamun in Egypt, an event that dominated global headlines for months on end and reshaped the general public's appetite for archaeological news almost overnight, practically inventing modern archaeological celebrity as a media phenomenon. Leonard Woolley began excavating at Tel el-Mukayyar, the same site identified as ancient Ur decades earlier, back in the 1850s, by J.E. Taylor's expedition. That very same year, working on behalf of a joint expedition, jointly funded and staffed by the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania Museum. Over the following 12 years of sustained fieldwork, his team would eventually excavate more than 1,800 individual graves scattered across the site, 16 of which stood out so dramatically in terms of their wealth, their scale, and their architectural sophistication that Woolley himself designated them, in his own field notes, as unambiguously royal. The sheer physical scale of the dig is almost as remarkable, in its own way, as what it eventually turned up. The royal tombs Woolley's team eventually uncovered consisted of sunken stone burial chambers, topped with vaulted stone roofs, reached by long ramps, deliberately cut down into the surrounding earth. In just a single working season, Woolley's crews moved roughly 140,000 square feet of accumulated soil, digging down nearly 60 feet in places to reach the earliest burial levels. This was not delicate, painstaking brushwork carried out on a small, manageable scale, the kind of careful single-object excavation modern viewers sometimes picture when they imagine archaeology. It was industrial-level excavation, sustained continuously over more than a decade of seasonal fieldwork, employing hundreds of local workers at a time, and it would eventually produce a body of finds that genuinely rivaled Carter's Egyptian discoveries in terms of the sheer intensity of public fascination they generated back home in both Britain and the United States. Woolley was, by most accounts, an unusually meticulous excavator for his era, and he brought his wife, the artist and writer Catherine Woolley, directly into the project, where she played a significant hands-on role in conserving and documenting the more delicate finds as they came out of the ground, including much of the fragile gold jewelry that would go on to define the public image of the entire dig. Woolley also made a point of publishing regular, accessible updates for a general audience alongside his more technical academic reports, a deliberate choice that did a great deal to keep the Ur excavation in the public eye across all 12 years of fieldwork, rather than letting interest fade the way it often does with longer-running academic projects. That steady stream of public communication is part of why so many people today, whether or not they could name a single other Sumerian site, have at least heard of Ur. Number 14. The Tomb of Queen Puabi. Among the 16 designated royal tombs, one stood apart from all the others for a fairly simple, practical reason. It had never, at any point in the intervening 4,500 years, been looted. Ancient Mesopotamian grave robbers, exactly like grave robbers operating in every other culture and every other era of human history, tended sooner or later to find their way into almost any sufficiently rich burial, and most of Ur's other royal tombs showed clear, unmistakable signs of ancient disturbance dating back many centuries. The tomb Woolley's team designated PG 800 did not show any such signs. Inside it, his team found the largely undisturbed remains of a woman whose identity they were able to firmly establish through her own personal cylinder seal. Buried alongside her and inscribed clearly with both her name and her formal title, Puabi. What emerged from that fully intact burial remains, even a full century later, among the single most recognizable images anywhere in all of Mesopotamian archaeology. An elaborate ceremonial headdress fashioned from gold leaves, ribbons, and strings of lapis lazuli beads, worn in multiple careful layers, alongside an extensive collection of jewelry, personal ornaments, and grave goods, all arranged with obvious ceremonial care and deliberate symbolic intent by the people who buried her. 25 separate attendants were found sacrificed within her tomb, arranged carefully around her body in a manner that would go on to define one of the single most unsettling and most widely and repeatedly discussed aspects of early Sumerian royal burial practice anywhere in the ancient Near East, a disturbing practice our very next discovery pushes considerably further still. Puabi's own identity has generated its own quieter scholarly debate over the decades. Her title, recorded on her seal, has occasionally been translated in ways that leave some ambiguity about whether she was a queen in her own right, a high priestess, or the wife of a king whose own tomb has never been separately identified. Woolley himself initially assumed she was a queen consort, but later, scholars have pointed out that nothing in the burial itself explicitly names a husband or requires one, and that the sheer scale of her tomb's wealth and the number of attendants sacrificed alongside her are, if anything, more consistent with a woman who held real independent authority. It's a useful example of how even one of the best documented individual burials in all of Sumerian archaeology still leaves genuine open questions once you look past the more famous photographs of the headdress itself. Number 13. The Great Death Pit. If Puabi's tomb firmly established just how much sheer material wealth Sumerian royal burial could involve, a separate chamber Woolley's team labeled PG 1237, and which almost immediately earned the grim nickname the Great Death Pit, among the excavation staff themselves, established with equal clarity just how far Sumerian court ritual was apparently willing to go when it came to accompanying a ruler into death. Inside this single chamber, excavators found 74 individual bodies, arranged carefully in orderly rows, many of them still wearing elaborate personal finery, positioned alongside musical instruments and various personal items, as though the entire group had been prepared for a solemn procession that, for reasons we can only guess at, never actually reached wherever it was meant to be going. Woolley's own original theory, developed at the time based on the physical evidence available to him, held that most of these sacrificed attendants had willingly, or at the very least passively, consumed some form of sedative or poison before being laid to rest alongside their ruler, based specifically on the apparent lack of obvious physical trauma he observed on most of the skeletal remains during his initial examination. It is worth being genuinely honest here about exactly where the current science actually stands on this question, rather than simply flattening a complicated, still unresolved debate down into a single tidy answer for the sake of a clean narrative. More recent forensic work, including detailed CT scans of a number of the recovered skulls conducted during the 2000s by independent research teams, has identified clear evidence of blunt force trauma in at least some of the individuals examined, which has meaningfully reopened active scholarly debate over exactly how voluntary, or alternatively, how outright violent, these mass ritual burials actually were in practice. This remains a genuinely live, unresolved question within the field today, rather than a settled fact in either direction, and any documentary that tells you otherwise is oversimplifying the evidence. What is not remotely in question, regardless of how that specific forensic debate eventually gets resolved, is the sheer scale of impact this discovery had at the moment it was first publicly announced back in the 1920s. It proved, beyond any reasonable doubt whatsoever, that Sumerian elite funerary ritual could be every bit as extreme, every bit as elaborate, and every bit as materially and humanly costly as anything already well documented from ancient Egypt, and it forced an entire generation of professional historians to take Sumerian conceptions of death, social status, and the afterlife considerably more seriously than most of them previously had. Comparable retinue burials, though rarely on the same scale as the Great Death Pit, have since been documented at a handful of other early Mesopotamian sites, suggesting this was not simply a single unusual event at Ur, but reflected a broader, if still poorly understood, elite funerary practice across the region during this early period. What makes the Ur example so uniquely valuable to researchers is less the burial's uniqueness and more its sheer preservation. The individual positions of the bodies, the placement of their instruments and jewelry, and the surrounding grave goods were all recorded in far more careful detail than at almost any comparable site excavated before modern forensic archaeology existed. That level of documentation is exactly what has allowed later researchers, working with tools Woolley never had access to revisit his original conclusions and begin asking sharper, more evidence-based questions decades after the original dig concluded. There is also a broader interpretive question worth raising here, one that reaches beyond the specific forensic debate over trauma. Some more recent scholarship has pushed back gently against the framing of these burials purely as evidence of coercion or brutality, pointing out that participation in elite royal funerary retinues may, in certain ancient court cultures, have carried real social prestige for the individuals and families involved, even where the practice still involved the person's death. That reading doesn't erase the disturbing reality of what happened in that chamber, but it does complicate any simple modern narrative that assumes ancient participants necessarily viewed their own deaths purely through a lens of victimhood, rather than through whatever complex mixture of religious duty, social status, and genuine belief in an afterlife the Sumerians themselves may have held. It's a difficult, uncomfortable area of interpretation, and honest scholarship tends to hold multiple possibilities open at once, rather than collapsing toward whichever explanation feels most comfortable to a modern audience. Number 12. The Standard of Ur. Recovered from that same general tomb complex, a small trapezoidal wooden box, roughly the size of a modern briefcase, and elaborately inlaid across its surfaces with shell, lapis lazuli, and red limestone, has gone on to become one of the single most widely reproduced images from the entire ancient Near East, appearing in textbooks and museum gift shops the world over. The Standard of Ur. Its two main panels are conventionally referred to as war and peace. One panel depicts Sumerian chariots trampling fleeing enemy soldiers underfoot, while other soldiers march bound captives forward before a seated king. The other panel shows an altogether calmer, more formal banquet scene, with attendants carrying food and drink toward a row of seated figures, accompanied by a musician playing what appears to be a lyre, very similar to the one recovered elsewhere in the same tomb complex. It is worth flagging clearly here, in the same spirit of intellectual honesty this entire story genuinely deserves, that the object's most famous and most widely used name may not actually describe its true original function at all. Standard was simply Woolley's own best working guess at the time, based largely on exactly where in the tomb it happened to be found, and its general overall shape, but a considerable number of scholars working since Woolley's day have proposed a range of alternative explanations, running from a resonating soundbox for a musical instrument to, more prosaically, the decorated lid of some kind of storage container. Nobody currently knows the true answer with any real certainty. That lingering uncertainty is not, in itself, a weakness in the underlying discovery. It is instead a genuinely useful reminder, heading into some of the far more contentious debates we'll get into later tonight, of just how much careful interpretation always sits between an excavated ancient object and whatever confident-sounding label eventually ends up attached to it in a museum display case, decades or even a full century later. Whatever its true original purpose, the images carved into its surface remain an extraordinarily rich historical resource in their own right. The war panel provides one of the earliest detailed depictions anywhere of Sumerian military equipment in actual use, including four-wheeled war carts pulled by teams of donkeys, helmeted infantry carrying cloaks and spears, and a clear visual hierarchy distinguishing the king from his soldiers by scale and posture. The peace panel, meanwhile, offers an equally valuable window into elite Sumerian social life, showing the kinds of food, drink, and musical entertainment considered fit for a formal royal banquet nearly 4,500 years ago. Together, the two panels function almost like a visual counterpart to the written king lists we'll spend so much of tonight discussing, one recording the formal succession of rulers in text, the other recording, in inlaid shell and lapis, what royal power in Sumer actually looked like in practice. Number 11. The Great Lyre and the Silt Layer beneath Ur. Our third act closes with two separate discoveries, pulled from the same general excavation, sitting almost literally on top of one another in the ground, when Woolley's team eventually reached them. The first is the Great Lyre, widely considered among the oldest surviving stringed musical instruments anywhere in the world. Its resonating soundbox, topped with a striking bull's head, crafted from a combination of gold and lapis lazuli. Recovered alongside it, from within the Great Death Pit itself, Woolley's team also uncovered the now famous statuette, conventionally known as the Ram Caught in a Thicket, a small, genuinely exquisite piece depicting a goat rearing up on its hind legs against a stylized flowering tree, worked skillfully in gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and shell. Both objects rank, without much serious argument from specialists, among the finest surviving examples of craftsmanship anywhere in the entire 3rd millennium BC world. But it is what Woolley found beneath these already extraordinary tombs, digging even further down into the mound, in a deliberate attempt to reach the very earliest layers of occupation at the site, that closes out this third act on its single most important note for our purposes tonight. Beneath the earliest burials his team had already excavated, they hit a distinct layer, roughly 8 feet thick, of clean, unmistakably water-laid silt, containing absolutely no artifacts, no bones, no trace whatsoever of any human activity of any kind. For that much genuinely sterile clay to have accumulated in one place, the entire surrounding valley would necessarily have needed to sit fully submerged under a significant depth of standing water for a sustained, extended period of time. Woolley himself connected this striking physical discovery directly to the flood traditions already well documented in both Sumerian and, more famously to a general Western readership, biblical literature. Remarkably similar sterile silt layers have since been independently identified at several other major Sumerian sites, including Shuruppak and Kish, generally sitting just above the very latest remains dating from the closing centuries of the 4th millennium BC. This is the specific thread that ties Act 3 directly into our closing segment tonight, so it is genuinely worth holding on to as we move forward. A real, physical, independently datable flood event sits right underneath Sumerian civilization's own foundational mythology, and it is going to matter enormously once we return to the Weld Blundell prism at the very end of this list. The Great Lyre itself deserves a slightly closer look before we move on, because its recovery was a genuine feat of field conservation as much as excavation. By the time Woolley's team reached it, the wooden body of the instrument had almost entirely decayed away, leaving only a fragile cavity in the soil where the wood had once been, along with the surviving gold and lapis decoration that had originally been attached to it. Rather than simply lifting out what physical material remained, Woolley pioneered a technique of pouring liquid plaster directly into the void left behind, allowing it to harden into an accurate cast of the vanished wooden structure before excavation continued. It's a detail worth pausing on, because it illustrates something true across much of this list. Sometimes the most important act of discovery isn't finding an object at all, but figuring out, in the field, in real time, how to rescue the ghost of an object that has already technically disappeared. Act 4. Kings, Laws, and the First Named Author. The first 3 acts of tonight's countdown moved steadily from proving that Sumer genuinely existed at all, to finding its cities and its earliest writing, to finally uncovering the almost unbearable material wealth buried alongside its royal dead. This 4th act shifts our focus once again, this time from objects toward people. This is where individual Sumerian names, for the very first time anywhere on this list, begin attaching themselves securely to real, individually verifiable human beings whose existence we can confirm through evidence entirely independent of legend. This distinction between a name and a verified person is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is easy to blur the two together without noticing. Plenty of names appear in Sumerian texts long before this point in our countdown. Gods, mythical heroes, early kings recorded only on the king list itself. What changes across this 4th act is something more specific: the appearance of independent, physically dated evidence, created during a person's own lifetime, confirming that a specific named individual actually existed and actually held the position later texts claim for them. That is a meaningfully higher bar than simply appearing in a later written tradition, however detailed or reverent that tradition might be. And it is exactly the bar this act's discoveries are going to clear, one figure at a time. Number 10. The Weld Blundell Prism and the Sumerian King List. In 1922, the same extraordinary year that opens both Woolley's landmark dig at Ur and Carter's famous tomb discovery in Egypt, a British expedition, led by Herbert Weld Blundell, working carefully at the site of Lhasa in southern Iraq, recovered the very same object we opened this entire video discussing, a 4-sided prism of baked clay, covered on every single face. It stands today as the single most complete surviving copy of what scholars universally refer to as the Sumerian King List, a document that reads less like a conventional royal genealogy and considerably more like the opening chapter of a formal mythology textbook, if that particular textbook had somehow been compiled by an obsessively precise government accountant with an unusually strong interest in cosmic order. Let's describe exactly what the document actually says, plainly and directly, before we get anywhere near the far more complicated question of how to properly interpret it. The text opens with the flat declaration that kingship itself descended directly from heaven, and that it was first held in the city of Eridu. It then goes on to list 8 individual rulers, spread across 5 separate cities, who are said to have reigned before a single great flood swept across the entire land, with individual reign lengths recorded in figures reaching into the tens of thousands of years apiece, the single longest recorded reign exceeding 40,000 years for one ruler alone. After the flood, the text states quite plainly, and without any apparent hesitation, that kingship had to descend from heaven for a second time, landing on this occasion in the city of Kish. The reign lengths recorded for this new post-flood dynasty are dramatically shorter than the earlier pre-flood figures, though still, by any reasonable modern standard, thoroughly extraordinary. The very first post-flood king listed is credited with a full 1,200 years on the throne. And then, gradually, dynasty by dynasty, city by city, as the list works its patient way down through successive ruling houses at Uruk, then at Ur, and onward beyond, the recorded reign lengths keep steadily shrinking, decade by decade, and generation by generation, until they finally settle into figures that look entirely ordinary and entirely plausible by modern historical standards. 30 years here, 20 years there, a reign abruptly cut short by battle or sudden illness. Exactly the kind of number modern historians recognize instantly and without a moment's hesitation from countless other ancient sources. The mainstream scholarly reading of those early, genuinely enormous numbers is worth stating with real clarity right here. because it is going to sit directly at the heart of our extended closing segment tonight. Most working historians and professional Assyriologists read the pre-flood reign lengths as fundamentally symbolic rather than strictly literal, a direct product of the Sumerians' own base 60 or sexagesimal counting system, in which clean, mathematically elegant multiples of 60 and of 3600 were deliberately used to signal a given ruler's divine status and cosmic legitimacy, rather than to record anything resembling an actual measured biological lifespan. It functions, on this widely accepted reading, something like calling a beloved historical leader a towering giant of his age in casual conversation today. Nobody listening seriously expects you to go looking for an actual 11-foot skeleton buried somewhere. We are going to return to this exact question in considerably more depth during our closing segment, laying out not just this single mainstream position in isolation, but the fuller range of ways serious historians have proposed reading this genuinely extraordinary document over the past century. For now, simply note carefully where and precisely when this object was found, and hold firmly onto that opening image of the small clay prism sitting quietly in its museum case, because we are, quite deliberately, ending tonight's countdown exactly where we began it. It's worth noting that the Weld Blundell prism is not actually the only surviving copy of the King list. It is simply the most complete one. Fragments and partial versions have turned up at a number of other sites over the past century, including Nippur, Isin, and Kish itself, each copied by a different generation of scribes, sometimes centuries apart, and each showing small variations in the order of cities, the names of individual kings, or the specific reign lengths recorded. These differences matter enormously to specialists, because they suggest the King list was never a single, fixed, unchanging document, handed down unaltered from some original source. It was a living scribal tradition, actively recopied, occasionally revised, and evidently adjusted at different points in time to reflect the political interests of whichever city happened to be compiling that particular copy. A detail that is going to matter directly when we get to our closing segment tonight. Number 9. Enmebaragesi, where myth meets verified history, buried beneath the ruins of the great temple of Enlil at Nippur, the exact same site that gave us Discovery 16 earlier tonight. Early 20th century researchers recovered a small set of inscribed alabaster vase fragments carrying a short, direct dedicatory inscription to Enmebaragesi, king of Kish. Described this way, it does not sound like a particularly dramatic find at all. It is, in point of fact, one of the single most important individual discoveries anywhere on this entire list. Enmebaragesi appears, by name, directly on the Sumerian king list as a ruler of the city of Kish, credited there with a reign of 9 full centuries. But the modest vase fragments recovered from Nippur accomplish something no other early entry anywhere on the king list can genuinely claim for itself. They independently confirm, through a real, physical object actually inscribed and dedicated during his own natural lifetime, that Enmebaragesi truly was a real, historically verifiable person, ruling in the region of Kish at some specific point around 2700 BC. He becomes, in effect, the very first king on the entire king list whose existence archaeology can confidently prove entirely on its own separate terms, completely independent of anything the king list itself happens to claim about him, one way or another. This creates a genuinely fascinating tension at the heart of the document, and it is worth pausing here to sit with that tension carefully, rather than simply rushing past it toward a tidier conclusion. The very same document that solemnly records Enmebaragesi's supposed 900-year reign is, on the independent strength of this one small inscribed vase, unmistakably describing a man we now know for an absolute certainty actually existed, walked the earth, and ruled a real kingdom. Whatever exactly is going on with those extended, seemingly impossible reign figures elsewhere in the text, it is clearly not a matter of pure invention, conjured entirely from nothing. It is something being deliberately layered on top of a genuine historical core that archaeology can independently verify. His son, a ruler recorded elsewhere in the tradition as Aga, is separately documented as having laid an unsuccessful siege to the city of Uruk, bringing him into direct, recorded conflict with a ruler whose own story would go on to become, by a wide margin, the single most famous and most widely retold in all of surviving Mesopotamian literature. It's worth pausing on just how unusual it is, in ancient historiography generally, for a single small inscribed object like this vase to carry so much weight. In most ancient traditions, the transition between legendary founding figure and historically documented ruler is gradual and blurry, worked out slowly by scholars comparing dozens of overlapping, imperfect sources against each other over many years. Here, that transition has a genuinely identifiable hinge point, a specific object found at a specific site that most specialists agree marks the exact spot on the king list where myth gives way to independently verifiable history. Very few ancient king lists anywhere in the world offer researchers that kind of clean, physically anchored dividing line, which is part of why Enmebaragesi's modest vase fragments punch so far above their weight in scholarly importance. It is also worth pointing out that Enmebaragesi's confirmation had a kind of quiet ripple effect on how scholars approached the rest of the king list. Once one entry could be independently verified, researchers had a natural incentive to go looking harder for physical confirmation of the names immediately surrounding him, both earlier and later in the sequence. That search hasn't produced anything nearly as clean for the pre-flood kings, which is itself telling, and feeds directly into the mainstream reading we'll lay out fully in the closing segment tonight. But it has, over the decades, turned up scattered corroborating evidence for a number of the somewhat later, post-Enmebaragesi rulers on the list, gradually filling in a rough, patchy, but genuinely evidence-based picture of exactly where the transition from legend to history occurs across the broader document, rather than relying on guesswork alone. Number 8. Gilgamesh, Uruk's walls, and the search for a historical king. That ruler, of course, is Gilgamesh, recorded plainly on the king list as the 5th king of the first dynasty of Uruk, credited there with a reign of 126 years. That particular figure is considerably more modest than the truly enormous pre-flood reigns discussed a moment ago, but it still sits comfortably beyond any ordinary plausible human lifespan, occupying an interesting and genuinely uncertain middle ground somewhere between outright legend and plausible historical fact. What makes Gilgamesh meaningfully different from almost every other name appearing anywhere on this list is precisely how directly his traditional story intersects with something we can still physically walk around and examine today. Uruk's real, extensively excavated fortification walls, the same 6 miles of walls we covered earlier back in Act 2, are explicitly and repeatedly credited to Gilgamesh both directly on the king list itself and, at far greater length, throughout the later literary epic that eventually came to bear his name. In 2003, a research team conducting detailed magnetic imaging surveys near the former ancient bed of the Euphrates River proposed that a large buried structure their equipment had identified might potentially correspond to traditional descriptions of a tomb specifically built for Gilgamesh. It is important to be entirely straightforward here about exactly where that particular claim currently stands. The proposed site remains largely unexcavated to this day. Ongoing access to it has been significantly complicated by regional instability in the years since, and this entire claim should genuinely be treated as an intriguing, unconfirmed possibility rather than as anything resembling a verified archaeological discovery. What we can say with real, well-founded confidence is this: Gilgamesh sits exactly, precisely, on the narrow seam separating documented history from enduring myth, backed by a real city, real excavated walls, and a genuine, independently attested king list entry, all wrapped together inside one of the most enduring and most widely translated literary traditions the ancient world ever managed to produce. Independent of the still unresolved tomb question, the archaeological record at Uruk does offer at least indirect support for the idea that the walls attributed to Gilgamesh reflect a real building program rather than pure invention. Excavated sections of the fortifications show clear evidence of at least one major phase of construction and reinforcement dating to roughly the period the king list assigns to his reign, distinct from earlier and later building phases visible in the same walls. That doesn't prove Gilgamesh personally ordered the work, any more than finding a well-built Roman road proves a specific named engineer designed it. But it does suggest that whoever compiled the king list, working centuries after the fact, was not inventing the walls from nothing. They were attaching a specific, memorable name to something the physical evidence shows genuinely happened. Number 7. The Library of Ashurbanipal and the Epic of Gilgamesh tablets. That literary tradition ultimately survived, in its fullest and most complete surviving form, not in Sumer itself at all, but rather in the ruins of a great Assyrian royal palace located hundreds of miles to the north. In the 19th century, The Iraqi-British archaeologist Hormuzd Rassam, excavating carefully at the site of Nineveh, uncovered the substantial remains of the royal library deliberately assembled by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, a vast, systematically organized collection of cuneiform tablets gathered from across the full breadth of the empire during the 7th century BC, representing what was likely the most ambitious library project attempted anywhere in the ancient world up to that point. In 1872, a British museum scholar named George Smith was working methodically through a portion of the tablets recovered from that library when he came across a flood narrative embedded within the larger Epic of Gilgamesh, a story built around divine warning, a massive purpose-built vessel, and a small surviving group tasked with repopulating the entire world afterward, bearing an unmistakable, immediately striking resemblance to the biblical account of Noah, familiar to virtually every reader in Victorian Britain. Smith's public announcement of this specific discovery caused an immediate sensation across British society, connecting Mesopotamian and biblical tradition for the very first time in a way the wider general public could genuinely grasp and get excited about, rather than something confined to a small circle of specialist scholars. The library itself technically belongs to Assyria and Babylon rather than directly to Sumer proper, but the epic it so carefully preserved traces its own roots back through much older, considerably more fragmentary Sumerian poems about Gilgamesh, clear proof of a literary tradition that survived, evolved, and kept being deliberately recopied by successive generations of scribes for well over 1,000 years before Ashurbanipal's own librarians ever finally got their hands on it. Smith's own path to that discovery is worth a moment of its own attention. He had originally trained as a banknote engraver with no formal university education, and taught himself cuneiform largely in his spare time by studying published transcriptions at the British Museum, eventually catching the attention of the museum's own Assyriology staff, who hired him based purely on demonstrated skill. When he first recognized the flood story while working through the tablets, he was reportedly so excited that he began undressing in the middle of the museum workroom, apparently intending to run outside and share the news immediately. The Daily Telegraph newspaper was excited enough by the discovery to fund an expedition sending Smith back to Nineveh in search of the missing pieces of the tablet, and remarkably, he succeeded in finding additional fragments that filled in some of the gaps in the original text. A rare example, even by the standards of this list, of a single scholar's personal excitement translating directly into new archaeological fieldwork. Number 6. The Stele of the Vultures. Our fourth act closes with a return to Ernest de Sarzec's original excavations at Lagash, and a single monument that ranks among the very oldest surviving examples of genuine historical narrative art anywhere in the entire world. The Stele of the Vultures commemorates a real, independently datable military victory, King Eannatum of Lagash's decisive defeat of the rival city of Umma, carved in detailed relief across a large stone slab, recovered in a number of separate fragments from the broader Girsu excavations at Tello. Its single most famous piece of imagery is also, without much question, its most brutal. Vultures shown carrying off the severed heads and severed limbs of defeated enemy soldiers, a stark and entirely unambiguous piece of deliberate royal propaganda, predating anything remotely comparable surviving from Egypt or the wider Mediterranean world by several full centuries. It matters here for two separate but closely related reasons. Archaeologically speaking, it is simply an extraordinary survival in its own right, a genuine, detailed, eyewitness-style visual account, permanently rendered in stone, of a specific, real war fought between two specific, real Sumerian cities. And thematically, it sets up exactly where our final act of tonight's countdown is headed next. A king actively justifying and permanently documenting his own exercise of political and military power, which is precisely the same fundamental underlying impulse that, a few centuries later, would eventually drive Sumerian rulers to begin putting their formal laws into writing for the very first time anywhere in recorded human history. The stele's accompanying inscription is, in its own way, just as significant as the imagery carved beside it. It records what many specialists consider the earliest known written account of a specific territorial boundary dispute between two named political entities anywhere in the historical record, describing the border conflict between Lagash and Umma over control of a fertile strip of agricultural land, and the terms under which Eannatum claimed to have settled it. In other words, this single object combines, in one place, some of the very earliest surviving evidence of organized warfare, of formal peace settlement, and of visual political propaganda, all wrapped around a dispute that, at its heart, was about something as mundane and enduring as who controlled a specific canal and a specific stretch of farmland. Border disputes over water and land, it turns out, are not a modern invention. Sumerian scribes were already carving them into stone nearly 4,500 years ago. Act 5. Numbers, Myths, and the Digital Afterlife. Our fifth and final act of discoveries tonight moves from ancient formal law and abstract mathematics all the way up into the current decade, including work being carried out right now, using tools no 19th century decipherer working by candlelight could ever possibly have imagined. There's a natural symmetry to closing tonight's countdown this way. We opened, back in Act 1, with human beings straining to read a completely unfamiliar script for the very first time, working entirely by hand, one laboriously copied symbol at a time. We close, in this fifth act, with human institutions, law codes, and named individual authors, the fullest expression of everything that decades of decipherment eventually made possible. And then, finally, with the newest chapter of all, researchers using computational tools to finish a translation project that has technically been underway, in one form or another, for well over 150 years. It is, in its own way, the same fundamental story told at 3 different speeds. Slow, patient, 19th century scholarship, the steady, decades-long accumulation of 20th century fieldwork, and now a 21st century acceleration that may, within a comparatively short span of years, finish reading a body of text that has sat waiting, in some cases, since before the pyramids were built. Number 5. The Code of Ur-Nammu, attributed directly to Ur-Nammu, founder of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, the very same royal line that would later go on to rebuild Ur's Great Ziggurat on a grander scale than ever before. The Code of Ur-Nammu predates the far more famous Code of Hammurabi by roughly 3 full centuries, making it, on current evidence, the single oldest known written law code discovered anywhere in the world to date. Recovered on a set of fragmentary cuneiform tablets, it lays out a coherent legal philosophy that feels, in several genuinely striking respects, more recognizably modern than its later, far more famous Babylonian successor. For a notably large number of specific offenses, it prescribes straightforward monetary compensation rather than direct physical punishment, representing a meaningfully different overall approach from the harsher eye for an eye model most casual readers today tend to associate, rightly or wrongly, with ancient Mesopotamian law in general. Its broader significance extends well beyond simple chronological bragging rights over Hammurabi. It demonstrates, with real physical evidence behind it, that organized, centrally administered, formally written legal systems existed in Sumer centuries earlier than most historians had previously assumed possible, and it clearly shows that this underlying legal thinking evolved meaningfully over time, rather than staying static. Hammurabi's later, notably harsher penalties were evidently not simply how ancient law always worked, as some kind of unchanging default, but rather one specific approach among several genuinely different philosophies the broader Mesopotamian world experimented with across the many intervening centuries. The surviving fragments of the code also open with a formal prologue, in which Ur-Nammu describes reforming weights and measures, removing corrupt officials, and protecting vulnerable members of society, such as widows and orphans, from exploitation by the wealthy. The same basic rhetorical formula later Mesopotamian rulers, Hammurabi included, would continue to use for centuries afterward when justifying their own legal authority. That continuity matters. It shows that by the time Hammurabi's much more famous code was carved nearly 300 years later, he was working within an already well-established genre of royal legal writing, one with its own conventions, its own expected structure, and its own centuries-old precedent, rather than inventing the entire concept of written law from scratch. Ur-Nammu, in that sense, doesn't just predate Hammurabi. He sets the template Hammurabi was still following. Number 4. Enheduanna, the world's first named author. If any single discovery anywhere on this list genuinely deserves to be called moving, in the fullest emotional sense of that word, it might well be this one. Enheduanna was the daughter of King Sargon of Akkad, formerly appointed as high priestess of the moon god Nana at Ur. She composed a substantial body of hymns and other poetic works that explicitly, quite deliberately, name her directly as their author. Not attributed anonymously to a temple institution or to some vague, unnamed tradition, but credited directly, by name, to one specific, identifiable individual woman, writing more than a full 1,000 years before Homer is traditionally believed to have composed his own famous epics. That fact makes her, on the full weight of current archaeological and textual evidence available, the earliest individually credited author of any gender documented anywhere in the entire history of world literature. An alabaster disc bearing her own carved image and formal inscription, recovered from excavations at Ur, sits today alongside the various cuneiform tablets that carefully preserve her surviving hymn cycles, devotional poetry addressed directly to the goddess Inanna that scholars continue to study seriously today, not merely as historical curiosities of academic interest, but as genuinely accomplished literary works, fully capable of standing on their own considerable merits. It is a genuinely rare thing anywhere in the study of the ancient world to be able to point confidently to one specific name, one specific individual human voice, whose personal perspective survives intact across roughly 4,000 years of intervening history. Enheduanna is one of the very few places anywhere in the entire ancient record where that remarkable claim is simply, straightforwardly, verifiably true. Beyond her authorship credit itself, Enheduanna's surviving compositions reveal a genuinely distinct personal voice, something rare enough in ancient religious writing that scholars have taken real notice of it. In several of her hymns, she describes her own political troubles directly, including a period in which she was apparently driven from her temple office during a political upheaval, and she frames her eventual restoration as a personal act of divine intervention on Inanna's behalf. That willingness to write about her own individual circumstances, rather than composing purely impersonal, formulaic praise poetry, is part of why modern literary scholars have increasingly studied her work not just as a historical curiosity, but as a genuine, identifiable artistic voice, arguably the earliest such voice we can reconstruct anywhere in the surviving record of world literature, male or female, from any culture on Earth. Number 3. Sumerian mathematics and Plimpton 322. We use it every single day of our lives without ever really stopping to think about where it originally came from. 60 seconds make up a minute, 60 minutes make up an hour, 360 degrees make up a full circle. All of it descends directly from the ancient Sumerian base 60, or sexagesimal, counting system, one of the single most enduring intellectual legacies to survive from the entire ancient world, embedded so deeply into the structure of modern daily life that most people never once pause to ask where any of it originally came from. Built directly on top of that same underlying mathematical foundation, a later Old Babylonian tablet, known to specialists as Plimpton 322, contains a carefully organized table of numbers that many scholars interpret as an early recorded set of Pythagorean triple-style relationships, specific sets of numbers describing the precise sides of right triangles, apparently compiled well over 1,000 years before Pythagoras is traditionally credited with discovering the theorem that still bears his name today. It is genuinely worth being upfront here that this remains a live, actively contested academic debate, rather than a fully settled matter of fact. Competing scholarly interpretations variously frame the tablet as an early trigonometric reference table, as a structured teaching aid intended for training scribal students, or more simply, as a straightforward administrative or land surveying document, and no single interpretation currently commands anything close to unanimous agreement among specialists working in the field. What is genuinely beyond serious dispute is the underlying 60-based counting system the tablet itself was built on, and the simple fact that you are, in a very real and immediate sense, still actively using Sumerian mathematics every single time you glance down at a clock face. Beyond Plimpton 322 specifically, the broader body of surviving Old Babylonian mathematical tablets built directly on this same Sumerian sexagesimal foundation, reveals a tradition capable of solving quadratic equations, calculating square roots to a striking degree of precision using purely numerical approximation methods, and working through fairly sophisticated problems involving area, volume, and interest calculation on loans. None of this was expressed using the symbolic algebraic notation familiar to modern students. There was no equals sign, no x standing in for an unknown quantity. But the underlying problem-solving techniques map remarkably closely onto methods still taught in schools today. It is a useful corrective to any lingering assumption that sophisticated mathematics is a comparatively recent human achievement. The core intellectual tools were already there, quietly, in the clay, nearly 4,000 years ago. Number 2. The Missing City. Ongoing digs at Gersu. This entire list is deliberately not meant to function as a static museum piece, frozen in time. It is still, quite literally, being written in real time, and this particular discovery stands as direct proof of that fact. Since 2016, a British museum-led initiative known formally as the Gyeosu Project has returned to the exact same site Ernest de Sarzec first opened, all the way back in 1877, and has, remarkably, uncovered a substantial monumental palace and temple complex, including a dedicated formal banqueting hall that had somehow gone completely undetected across a century and a half of prior excavation work already conducted at that very same mound. It offers a genuinely useful corrective to how countdown videos of this general type tend to leave people feeling by the end. It is easy enough to walk away from a list like this one, assuming that the great age of major Sumerian discovery effectively ended somewhere back in the 1930s, with Wooley's spectacular royal tombs at Ur. It didn't. Active, ongoing fieldwork, now employing modern geophysical survey methods layered carefully on top of a site that has already been dug into repeatedly for well over a century, is still meaningfully rewriting our collective understanding of exactly how Sumerian city administration actually functioned in practice. The ground at Gyeosu, it turns out, still had considerably more left to say, even after a century and a half of people assuming it had already given up everything it had. Part of what made the newer discoveries possible was simply better technology rather than better luck. Ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and high-resolution drone photography allow modern teams to map an enormous buried footprint before ever putting a single spade into the soil, letting excavators target exactly the most promising sections of an enormous site rather than digging comparatively blind, the way de Sarzec effectively had to in the 1870s. The 2022 discovery of the Gyeosu Governor's Palace, sitting almost directly beneath ground that had already been surveyed and partially excavated multiple times across the preceding century, is a genuinely humbling demonstration of how much even a well-studied site can still be hiding, simply because earlier excavators lacked the tools to see what was sitting just a few meters further down or a few meters off to the side of where they happened to be digging. Number 1. AI-assisted cuneiform translation and the new digital archive. We close out tonight's entire countdown not with a single physical object pulled carefully from the earth, but instead with a tool. Researchers currently estimate that something in the general neighborhood of 500,000 individual cuneiform tablets sit today in museum and university collections scattered across the entire world, and the overwhelming majority of that enormous total remains completely untranslated to this day, either because there simply are not nearly enough trained specialist cuneiformists in the world to work steadily through such an enormous backlog, or because individual tablets are physically fragmented, with separate pieces of what was originally a single document scattered across entirely different collections on different continents, sitting unmatched and unrecognized as belonging together for decades at a stretch, or sometimes considerably longer. Machine learning models are now actively being trained to read damaged, incomplete cuneiform script with a useful degree of reliability, and perhaps even more usefully, to help automatically identify when two entirely separate physical fragments held in two entirely separate museums actually belong to one single original tablet, a genuinely difficult matching problem that has historically depended almost entirely on individual human scholars simply happening, by pure chance, to personally recognize a connection across collections they had both, coincidentally, examined firsthand at some point in their careers. The projected impact of this technology on the overall pace of translation work over the coming years is considered significant by researchers actively working in the field. It is a genuinely strange thought to sit with, closing out a countdown built almost entirely around dramatic physical discoveries pulled directly from the ground. The 25th great Sumerian find on this entire list might not turn out to be a golden headdress or an elaborately carved stone monument at all. It might instead simply be a piece of software running quietly on a server somewhere, patiently matching two broken pieces of the exact same 4,000-year-old tablet that have sat, entirely unrecognized as belonging to each other, in two different countries for the better part of an entire century. Several university and museum partnerships have already begun releasing large digitized tablet datasets specifically to train these kinds of models, effectively crowdsourcing part of the translation backlog by making it possible for machine learning systems to learn cuneiform sign shapes from many thousands of already published examples at once. Early results have reportedly been promising enough that some specialists now describe the field as approaching a genuine inflection point. comparable in scale, if not yet in cultural fame, to the original 19th century decipherment breakthroughs we open tonight's countdown with. There is something quietly fitting about that parallel. The story of Sumerian archaeology began with human beings painstakingly teaching themselves to read a lost script, one symbol at a time. It may end up being carried forward, at least in part, by machines doing something similar, at a scale no individual scholar, however dedicated, could ever hope to match working alone. We opened tonight with a small, unassuming clay prism, and we promised we would eventually come back to it directly. So let's come back to it now, in full. The Weld Blundell prism claims, in plain and unhesitating language, that 8 kings, ruling in succession across 5 separate cities before a single great flood, reigned collectively for a combined total that runs well into the hundreds of thousands of years. It would be genuinely tempting here, especially in the kind of countdown video specifically built around dramatic final reveals, to lean hard into the sheer mystery of that number and simply leave it hanging unresolved for effect as we head toward the credits. We are deliberately not going to do that tonight. Instead, we are going to lay out, as plainly and as fairly as we possibly can, the actual genuine range of positions serious professional historians currently hold on this specific question, because the honest, complicated answer turns out to be considerably more interesting than the artificially mysterious one. The first position, and by a wide and genuinely uncontroversial margin, the current mainstream academic consensus, treats those enormous early reign lengths as fundamentally symbolic in nature rather than strictly literal. The Sumerians built their entire counting system around the number 60, and the pre-flood reigns recorded on the king list are, again and again throughout the text, clean, mathematically elegant, round multiples of 60 and of 3600, numbers apparently chosen quite deliberately for their mathematical elegance and their strong cultural association with cosmic order and divine legitimacy, rather than numbers genuinely intended to describe any kind of actually measured biological lifespan. On this widely accepted reading, telling an ancient Sumerian audience that a particular king had reigned for tens of thousands of years functioned in roughly the same rhetorical way it functions today when we casually describe some towering historical figure as larger than life. Nobody hearing that phrase goes looking for an actual 11-foot skeleton. And ancient Mesopotamian audiences, steeped in this same shared cultural and mathematical vocabulary, almost certainly understood exactly what specific kind of claim was actually being made about that ruler. The second position, which does not necessarily contradict the first reading so much as it sits comfortably alongside it, suggests that at least some, and quite possibly all, of these unusually long individual reigns might actually represent entire extended dynasties or full historical eras of continuous rule, deliberately compressed down and preserved under the convenient name of one particularly significant founding or otherwise memorable individual ruler. Not entirely unlike how a modern historian today might casually use a phrase like the Victorians to sweep several full decades of genuinely complex social, political, and technological change conveniently under one single, tidy label. Under this particular reading, a reign of 900 years attributed on the surface to one single named king might, in reality, be quietly describing several successive generations of that same ruling family's continued dynastic rule, all remembered collectively under the founding ancestor's original name. And then there is a third category, genuinely worth acknowledging honestly and directly here, precisely because it does actually exist out in the world, and it genuinely shapes how a great many people first encounter this particular material online. More speculative, distinctly popular readings, often built loosely around the broader idea of some kind of lost advanced prehistoric civilization, sometimes tied more specifically to claims about sophisticated ancient astronomical knowledge supposedly embedded directly within these numbers, or occasionally tied to the idea that the recorded reign lengths represent something considerably closer to a literal, if badly garbled over time, biological record of actual lifespans. These particular interpretations are not accepted anywhere within mainstream professional archaeology today, and it is worth being entirely direct here about exactly why that is the case. They generally require reading these specific numbers, quite literally, directly against a large and genuinely independent body of fossil, genetic, and archaeological evidence concerning early human history more broadly. evidence that simply does not support the existence of individual human reigns or individual human lifespans running anywhere into the tens of thousands of years. That fact does not, in itself, make the underlying question uninteresting to ask. Why exactly the Sumerians chose to record their own perceived deep past in precisely this particular way remains a genuinely live, genuinely fascinating open puzzle worth continued serious study. It simply means that, on the full weight of current evidence available to us, the single most dramatic possible explanation is not, in fact, the single most likely one. What ties this entire ongoing debate back down to something concrete and physically verifiable is the very same thick layer of sterile silt Leonard Woolley discovered directly beneath the royal tombs of Ur, covered earlier tonight back in Act 3. A real, physical, independently datable flood horizon, closely echoed at several other major Sumerian sites, including Shuruppak and Kish, sitting almost exactly where the king list itself independently places its own great flood within the broader narrative. The current geological consensus among specialists working on this question does not point toward one single, planet-spanning global event, but rather toward a documented series of genuinely severe, regionally catastrophic flooding episodes along the Tigris and Euphrates river systems, most likely driven by a combination of heavy glacial meltwater and periods of extreme weather several thousand years ago. An event that, to any civilization living entirely within the confines of a single flat, low-lying river valley, would have looked and felt, in every meaningful practical sense, exactly like the literal end of the entire known world. That shared collective trauma almost certainly sits underneath three genuinely separate literary traditions we have touched on at various points tonight. The original Sumerian flood story itself, the later Babylonian flood narrative carefully preserved within the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the still later biblical story of Noah, familiar to billions of people today. Different names attached to the surviving flood hero across each tradition. Ziusudra within the original Sumerian tradition, Utnapishtim within the later Babylonian version, Noah within the Hebrew tradition, but unmistakably the same underlying narrative structure running through all three, and quite possibly, when you strip away the specific names and later theological elaboration, genuinely the same underlying shared historical memory. It's worth adding one further wrinkle here, because it genuinely complicates any attempt to land on a single, tidy conclusion. And complicating a tidy conclusion is, if anything, exactly what good history is supposed to do. Even among historians who firmly reject a literal reading of the pre-flood rains, there is real, ongoing disagreement about how self-aware the Sumerians themselves actually were about the symbolic nature of these numbers. Some specialists argue the scribes compiling the king list understood perfectly well they were working in a symbolic, honorific register, the same way a modern speechwriter understands that calling a leader a titan of industry isn't a biological claim. Others argue that by the time later copies of the list were being produced, centuries after the events they described, at least some scribes and their audiences may have genuinely believed these were real elapsed years, the way a distorted oral tradition can gradually calcify into literal belief, even when it began as poetic exaggeration. We don't currently have a way to fully settle that particular question, because it depends on reconstructing the internal mental state of people who left us their conclusions but not, unfortunately, their internal reasoning. It's a genuinely humbling reminder that even when the physical evidence itself is solid, the exact meaning a given ancient audience attached to it can remain stubbornly out of reach. So where does all of this leave us? 25 separate discoveries and a couple of genuinely long hours later. Every single object we have covered tonight, from a dangerous decoded cliff inscription hanging above a mountain road to a piece of machine learning software quietly matching broken clay fragments across continents in real time, is really telling us the exact same underlying story in 25 meaningfully different ways. 200 years ago, quite literally, nobody alive knew this particular civilization had ever existed at all. Today we know, with real and growing confidence, that it invented the city as we still understand that word, invented writing itself, invented the formally written legal code, produced the very first individually named author anywhere in the entire history of world literature, and built a counting system so genuinely good that we are all still actively using it every single time we glance casually down at a clock. The little clay prism sitting quietly in its museum case tonight, with its impossible kings and its flood that neatly splits recorded history cleanly in two, is not, on the best current evidence, proof of some vanished ancient world of literal giants. It is, arguably, something considerably more remarkable than that particular fantasy. It is the oldest surviving attempt by any human civilization anywhere on record to explain, carefully and deliberately, in its own words, exactly where its people believed they had originally come from. If you ever find yourself standing in front of that little prism in person, whether in London or in any of the traveling exhibitions that occasionally carry it, or comparable king list fragments to other museums around the world, it's worth taking a moment most visitors never do, reading past the impossible numbers to the actual structure of the document underneath them. Notice how carefully organized it is, city by city, dynasty by dynasty, each transition marked with the same formal language, each king given his exact reign length down to the year, as though the scribe compiling it genuinely believed precision itself was a form of respect owed to the dead. That impulse, to record, to number, to make sure nothing and no one gets lost to time without at least a name and a number attached, runs through every single discovery on tonight's list, from Kushim's humble barley ledger all the way to Enheduanna's deeply personal hymns. It is, in the end, a remarkably familiar impulse. It is the same one driving anyone who has ever kept a journal, backed up a hard drive, or told a story about a grandparent specifically so it wouldn't be forgotten. The Sumerians simply happened to be doing it first, in clay, at a scale, and with a level of ambition nobody around them had ever attempted before. So, what's your take on all of this? Do the numbers recorded on that ancient prism feel to you like some kind of deliberate mathematical code, a compressed folk memory of real historical dynasties, or something else entirely different that we haven't even considered tonight? Drop your own theory down in the comments below and let us know what you think. And if you would specifically like to see a full, dedicated deep dive built entirely around the Sumerian king list debate on its own, every serious argument, every serious counter-argument, laid out carefully from start to finish in far greater depth than tonight allowed, let us know in the comments, and we will absolutely make that video happen. Thanks so much for spending this one with us tonight. Until next time, stay curious.